Samuel French assured me that Sleuth had been produced somewhere every day in the world since it was written. That was 30 years ago. Well, with some immodesty, I have to tell you that it had notices that would probably have been accorded to the Second Coming. The man who was writing for the Times wrote, "This is simply the best thriller I have ever seen." Well, if I had written that myself, I couldn't have done better. And that is quite enough of self-aggrandizement. The rest, as they say, is history. Anthony Quayle, who had been cast, said this is a very trivial title. So I said, well, let's go back to basics. What is this play about? A man who was obsessed with the 30s detective, who was usually a gentleman, who seemed to solve with ease those matters that where the police, as they used to say, were invariably baffled.
Frankly, sir, we in the police force are just plain baffled.
What did they call that person? I said, surely that name is... They called him a sleuth. Anthony Quayle was very, very funny about it. He said, it's a bit common, isn't it? And I'll tell you something, I won't march through Coventry with it. Many years later, I heard he only had 5 weeks to live. So I hurried round to where he was living then in Chelsea Green, just to say, you know, farewell. And he said to me, you gave me the best part of my life. And I said, no, I don't think so. What about Falstaff? What about, you know, Barbus, all the other big parts, Shakespeare and Wells? He said, don't be silly, I'm talking about a modern play. I said, well, thank you. He said, on the other hand, I have a fence to mend with you. And that was that opposition to the name, the title of the play, and all that business of not marching through Coventry, but it's a very pompous thing to say. He said, I'll be going off presently, as you probably know. And if they will have me there, I hope to march into heaven with it. Beautiful statement. Juiced me to tears, no question. Does to this day. Olivier was the studio's first choice. My first choice, probably foolishly, was Anthony Quayle, who had originated the role. Well, I recognized that of the two names, Olivier is infinitely the greatest marquee name, and anyone who turns down Laurence Olivier for a role of that complexity and variation and labial quality is asking for the gods to abandon him.
You are the complete clown.
The curious thing was that when Anthony Quayle was doing it, when we opened, Larry came along and he said to Quayle, you were a director of the Shakespeare Memorial Theatre at Stratford. What are you doing in a piece of piss like this? Curious remark. Quayle said, well, I'm sorry you take that view. We are very happy with the play, and so are our audiences. I think that's not a very nice thing to say. Well, speak as you find, old boy. He wasn't speaking that way a few years later when the studio asked him to do the role. Curious side, that of Larry, that from time to time he would be less than generous to his fellow actors.
A jumped-up pantry boy who doesn't know his place!
Michael Caine was really scared about working with Larry Olivier. He thought he would overwhelm him. On the first day of shooting, he was sitting in his dressing room, Michael, all his freckles up, pale-faced, shaking, and I said to Mr. Mankiewicz, have you seen Michael this morning? He said, I don't think he's up for much. He looks really ill. He said, yes, I think he's upset about how to deal with Larry. Well, I said, why don't you let him settle down a bit? Let's have a honeymoon period and let the two old pros settle down together and tell each other both of them are fine, raconteurs, and we'll start tomorrow. First thing that happens is that Larry comes up, and Michael says to him, well, what do I call you? And Larry says, well, it's very simple, really. You are Mr. Michael Kane, and I am the Lord Olivier. And Michael was quite aghast, right? He said, that's just for the first time, of course, dear boy. After which, of course, you are Mike and I am Larry. You know. He was just winding him up.
It ain't funny no more.
It ain't it? Can you find a flaw in it?
And all seemed in very good shape, and I thought we'd won that game, and it was a useful honeymoon period. Just before they were going to throw the breakers, disaster struck. You may, of course, remember that Olivier was married and deeply in love with Vivian Leigh, many years of his life. He suddenly looks over at Michael Caine. He says to him, you know, dear boy, looking at you like that, with your head tilted, you look much like the late lamented Leslie Howard. Oh, him, says Michael. Well, he always looked as if butter wouldn't melt in his mouth. I tell you, he had all his leading ladies whoppo straight up. There was a dreadful silence. Larry's fastened on the hapless Caine. Not, I think, dear boy, he said. In Gone with the Wind. The honeymoon was over. Thank you very much for the honeymoon period. That just cost me $500,000, says Joe Mank. Caine wasn't the least bit fazed. He said, well, that taught me never to take my eye off the old boy, didn't it? I learned something today. That's how he became the fine actor, really fine actor he's become. Meticulous worker. He never criticized Olivier. Larry was suffering from very severe memory problems at that time. And sometimes we go to take 20, take 30, take 40. And I went up to him and said, you're an absolute saint, Michael, going through this. The old boy, I don't know, he's a bit all over the place. He's had 3 terminal illnesses, which he had towards the end of his life. He said, are you kidding? He said, I'm getting an acting lesson here that I couldn't buy for love or money. Every take he comes at me from a different direction, a different emphasis, a different action. He is incomparable, and I'm enjoying every moment of this. The two men, as we know, played brilliantly together, and Olivier finished by saying, when I started with Michael, I thought I had an assistant. I soon came to realize I had a full partner.
Do you agree that the detective story is the normal recreation of noble minds?
Edgar Sherrick wanted to put an intermission in the movie, 10 or 15 minutes, which completely ruined it, because Joe had designed a beautiful cinematic montage progression between the 2 days. This was absolutely murdered by this intermission. And Joe finally said, under no circumstances will I allow this to happen. Otherwise it really means a big court fight. I'm not giving it. So we tried out in Hartford, Connecticut, that the people loved the show, luckily, as it was. They were sufficiently encouraging for Edgar to say, okay, we'll leave it alone. And so there we are. And this, ladies and gents, brings us to the end of a lengthy Sleuthean journey.
Why should it be you have the power to hear